Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have my guest, Mr. Simon Black, an entrepreneur as well as investor who's the founder of sovereignman.com. Today he's going to join us to share his thoughts on the global economy as well as on fiat currencies. And he also offers a variety of free information on his website in regards to banking overseas and obtaining a second passport as well as precious metal storage abroad. So Simon Black, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Thanks for allowing me to be here.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to sit down with me. Definitely looking forward to diving into a lot of the things that you offer, things that you do, being that you're an international guy that travels and happens to do a lot of research from various viewpoints. So before we actually get into those details, I typically start off with some Rethinking the Dollar questions. And the first question is, what comes to mind when Simon Black hears the words Rethinking the Dollar?
Truth. That's the first thing that comes to mind. This is something that, depending on where you grew up, I imagine most of the people listening to this might be from the United States, but I mean, the dollar is the most widely used currency in the world, and people just sort of take this thing for granted. You and I were talking before, you've been down to South America. I'm in Chile. I've traveled all over the world. I've seen, you and I have both seen what happens when people lose confidence in paper currencies. And these things can happen very, very quickly, and there are obviously a lot of consequences associated with that. But when you really look at the dollar, you're talking about a system that is controlled by a bunch of unelected central bankers who are not held accountable, that just they have all the power in the world. They could roll out of bed tomorrow morning and decide to dramatically change the money supply and the value of the currency associated with that, and nobody else has anything to do with that whatsoever. It's an absolutely absurd system, and one that I'm convinced that at some point down the road, future historians will probably look back and wonder, scratch their heads, and think, how could those people possibly have allowed that to happen?
Right.
That's what I think when I hear Rethinking the Dollar.
Right. All right. Thanks for answering that question. So the next one is, being that there's so much going on in the world right now, whether it be the banking crisis or just the push to remove cash from citizens' hands, I believe there's no greater time in history other than right now than to begin taking, interest in monetary awareness, or monetary literacy, as I like to call it. And so in your opinion, why do you think it might be important as well?
I like the way that you put it, monetary literacy. I think that's right. It's funny because monetary literacy is probably an important part of even financial literacy. It's an even bigger picture of financial literacy. And I think a lot of people, particularly those that don't find themselves in the financial positions that they want to be in, a big part of that is because so many people actually do lack financial literacy. People don't really understand what to do with their money, how to invest, how to create value, how to start a business, how to do all these things, because none of that stuff is really, none of it's taught in school. In school, you don't really learn, what do wealthy people do to become wealthy? How do people actually generate substantial investment income and start with very little and grow their wealth and so forth? And a big part of that, I think, is monetary literacy as well, is understanding not only investments in capital markets and finance, but actually even understanding the bigger picture behind that, understanding how these decisions get made to regulate the value of a currency and the risks that are associated with that. It's a dramatic part of it. And as we're seeing this right now in an environment with negative interest rates and central bank balance sheets that are at all-time highs, and leverage in the system that are all-time highs, and global debt at an all-time high, I think you're right. I mean, this is clearly the right time for people to look around and think, this is the thing. I think people look around and they think, there's something wrong. There's something clearly wrong. And I think people understand that. The problem is that they don't understand what. They know that something is wrong, but they don't know what it is. And monetary literacy helps them actually identify what the problem is. People who are literate about the monetary system could look back and go, oh, I get it. It's because they held interest rates down for so long that this bubble was created, which created this, which caused that, and that's a big part of it, because otherwise you start blaming a lot of other things. It's easy to say, oh, it was rich people, or it was capitalists, or it was this, or it was that, or it becomes easy to blame other things if you don't actually understand the problem. And monetary literacy right now, I think, is the most important thing to help people understand the problem.
Right, right. I do agree, and I kind of taking a mindset of 2017 is going to be the most important year for the most part, where people globally begin to really take interest in learning the difference between what has been historical money and what's fiat currency. So being able to distinguish those two will basically open the door up to where people can look back and to kind of see the history behind what has been labeled as money, in hopes of making better decisions for their own personal finances in the days ahead. So. Thank you for sharing your thought there. Now, another question is, being that you're a guy that kind of travels often, you have a very unique perspective, being that you've actually been in certain areas and countries that are going through some problems. And so if you were asked to give what I would consider the global state of the economy address, what all would it entail and why?
Mm. The global state of the economy, it's interesting. You'd have to break it down into a couple of different areas. I mean, China is in and of itself its own category. For example, I think I hate to lump, for example, Africa into an entire category because. Uh, Uganda is entirely different than Angola, which is entirely different than South Sudan. But there's a completely different story happening on the African continent. There's a completely different story that's emerging in Western Europe, and now the UK is kind of its own story and so forth. But if I look at the world as a whole, um, just to be clear, I'm an optimist. I think this is the most exciting time to be alive. I think that our species has seen some of the worst things ever in our history. And we have always found a way that no matter what happens as a species, we adapt and overcome. We rise and we thrive. The system changes. That always happens. When there's great turmoil, people always rise up, and there are system changes that come as a result of that turmoil. We can go back and we can see what happened as a result of the French Revolution, for example, one of the most tumultuous periods in history. World War II, that was a tremendous period of turmoil, and everything that developed, the system changes worldwide that developed because of World War II. We may very well be in that position now, where there are a number of systems in place, the monetary system, our various political systems, and so forth, and we can see that a lot of these things are, I mean, the monetary system in many respects is nothing more than an experiment, where people got together a long time ago and they said, a century ago, and they said, hey, I got an idea. Let's get a bunch of guys together who aren't elected and award them totalitarian control of the money supply. And then somebody says, well, where do we select these people from? They said, oh, well, we'll let the banks pick them. That's just, part of monetary literacy. That's the thing that always blows people's minds when I try and explain to them. I said, do you know where these people come from? A lot of the people on the Federal Reserve Board, the guys that make the policy decisions, are selected from the various ranks of the Federal Reserve Bank presidents. Where do those guys come from? They're appointed from the boards of the Federal Reserve banks. Where do those guys come from? Most of them are selected by the banks. So the banks are essentially now the ones who are appointing the people who end up drawing from the ranks of the ones who create the monetary policy that the banks themselves benefit from. It's such a crazy conflict of interest. And 100 years ago, somebody says, I got an idea, let's do that. And people said, oh, that's great. What a great idea. Let's do that. And I have to imagine people said, what, are you kidding me? You're going to try this? And it's lasted 100 years. And all along the way, every shred of evidence shows that, like, wait a minute, this is probably a bad idea. And they keep engineering bubble after bubble after bubble after bubble. They created this massive bubble. In the 1990s, they had a bunch of big failures and so forth in the early 1990s, and so they inflated the money supply, and we got this massive bubble in the dot-com boom. And then that burst, and people said, "Oh man, that was terrible. What do we do now?" And the central bank said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And so they printed a bunch more money, and they papered over the bubble they had before. They created an even bigger bubble. That time it was a housing bubble, and then that burst. And how did they deal with that? They said, "Oh, let's just print more money." And so now they expanded the balance sheet to $4.5 trillion, and it's this massive financial bubble. We can see this all over the world. It's like, well, what do you expect is going to happen? And the ones that have benefited from this, the banks have had a lot of benefit from this. And of course, they're the ones that end up being able to appoint these people to directorships and presidents of the Federal Reserve banks that end up being on the board that creates the monetary policy. And you just have to ask yourself and say, this is designed in the system. What do you think is going to happen? But now they're at the point where, whether it happens this year or next year or whatever, I can't I cannot predict the future. What I can see are pretty obvious trends. And the trends are when you see interest rates at zero, when you see interest rates below zero in negative territory, you start wondering, what else can these people possibly do? They've reached, that's the end of the rope. Their backs are against the wall. They've run out of options. And so you look at let's just briefly examine 2008.
Mm-hmm.
In 2008, we had this massive financial crisis. The Federal Reserve's total balance sheet was $850 billion. It's more or less about the size of the amount of its assets. Now, the central bank has capital. Basically, this is sort of like the bank's net worth. This is its rainy day fund. It's in case something happens, they have their capital. All banks have capital. Capital is essentially the difference between their assets and liabilities. Just like you and I have assets and liabilities, the difference between the two of that is our net worth. The banks all have net worth, and the idea is that if something happens to their assets, their loans and their bonds and so forth, then they can always at least dip into their little capital, their rainy day fund. So you want a strong bank is one that has a lot of capital as a percentage of his assets. And this is where Lehman Brothers, for example, famously got into trouble because they said Lehman Brothers was so over leveraged, its capital is only 3% of its assets. And what that meant was basically when the financial crisis kicked off, that if Lehman Brothers assets fell by more than 3%, Lehman Brothers was finished. It was insolvent. And of course, that's what happened. The assets fell by way more than 3% because their assets were all, these people that weren't paying their loans and their mortgages, and their bonds that they were holding were worthless. And so Lehman Brothers assets fell by a lot more than 3%. And the bank went under because they didn't have a sufficient margin of safety. They didn't have sufficient capital. Lehman Brothers went under when their capital was 3% of their assets. The Federal Reserve's capital as a percentage of assets now is 0.9%.
Wow.
So you have to look at that and say, back in 2008, the Federal Reserve's capital wasn't very high, but it was still higher than it is now. It was about 4.5–5%. Now it's 0.9%. So what's happened over the last several years is that the Fed's margin of safety has gone down to almost zero. And you have to look at this and say, okay, in 2008, the Fed was in a position to do something. There was a big crisis. This big bubble burst, and the Fed was in a position to do something about it. They could go and they could print a bunch of money, and they had sufficient capital to bear the risk. They had at least 4.5–5%. So they were okay. They weren't in great position. They at least had enough capital left. They could at least do something to try and stave off the crisis, to prevent this huge contagion from taking place. Now they don't have that ability anymore. What are they going to do now? You don't have any capital. You have 0.9%. You don't have any ability to handle a crisis. And by the way, I would encourage any of your viewers to look this up themselves. Every single week, I look at this religiously. The Fed comes out with a report it's called the H41 report. You can just Google that. You can Google H41 Federal Reserve, and you'll see this, and you can see it every single week. They do this every Thursday at 4 p.m. And every single week they send this out, and I think it's item 6. The Fed posts its balance sheet. They say, here's all of our assets and here's all of our liabilities. And you can see the difference between the two. You can see the capital. And all you have to do is look at the capital as a percentage of the Federal Reserve's assets and go, holy crap. This is 0.9%.
Wow.
It's nothing. And if you go back, you can see the historical ones. You can go back to 2006. And see 2007, you can see what it was 10 years ago, and see the erosion of the federal bank's balance sheet, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet over the last 10 years. And it's just dramatic, astounding decline. And any rational person has to look at that and go, even if you don't understand anything about monetary policy, even if you're not, even if you don't have monetary literacy, anybody is going to look at that chart of this decline in capital and go, that doesn't look good. And then if you start to understand this, you have to go, well, wait a minute. Okay, every time there's a crisis, it's the Federal Reserve that steps in and says, don't worry, we'll take care of it. We'll fix the crisis that we ourselves created by doing the same thing that created the crisis to begin with. You created a crisis by printing too much money, and so they're going to solve it by printing more money.
Wow.
Which is just madness.
Yeah, it won't work
and then
out.
you look at the numbers and you say, okay, maybe you had the ability to do that in 2008. But now you don't have the ability to do that. What are you going to do in 2017 if there's a big crisis in 2017? What are you going to do?
Right.
And then you look at the historical data and say, okay, In the United States, there's a recession, roughly every 6 to 8 years. There's a recession, whether it's big or small. There's at least some kind of recession. So since the peak to trough from the end of the last recession to now, we're basically in that well within that window. Then you look at it and you say, okay, what does the central bank do on average every time there's a recession? Every time there was a recession, on average, the Federal Reserve cuts rates by several hundred basis points. We're talking, 2, 3, 4%. That's the average interest rate cut in a recession. So I would pose to any rational person to say, well, when interest rates are, they just raise rates. Now we're at 0.5%. Whoop-de-doo, 0.5%. What are you going to do when interest rates are 0.5%, and now we're in our sort of recession window? What is the central bank going to do? They have no capital. They have no room to cut interest rates. They can't. If you cut interest rates by 2.5%, and interest rates are now 0.5%, that means that gives you, it's been a long time since I had third grade arithmetic, but that's minus 2%. 0.5% minus 2.5%, that's minus 2%. You have no capital. You have to take interest rates into negative territory. And these people don't have any ammunition left. And so all they're left with is this hope that there's never again until the end of time ever going to be another recession. Right. That's the strategy. Right. That's the strategy. And so I think any rational person has to look at it and go, okay, there's got to be something else going on here. I've got to do something about this.
Right. And that plays into my next question, because you kind of hinted at it, and it's about 2017. We're a couple of days into the new year, and a lot of things are happening in the next couple of weeks, the next 10 days exactly. President-elect Donald Trump is set to become president, the 45th president. Let's play out a couple of scenarios looking ahead, because you kind of mentioned that every couple of years there's a recession. Some guys say we're currently in recession now. It just hasn't come to the surface yet. And so Trump also has a nice spending package he's looking to put together as well. So just play a couple scenarios. Recession comes this year, Trump's spending plans, and the Fed's lack of capital. All three of those scenarios in 1 year or two. What does that look like for me and you, or us here located in the United States of America?
I'm more likely to be the starting quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys this year. I mean, all that stuff. I mean, it's just a bunch of. It's none of this stuff is possible. You cannot have. Oh, that's the other part of it, right? In 2008, the government was only $9.5 trillion in debt. Yeah. The government, and at a percentage of GDP, was 60-70% of GDP, which was high, but not as high as it is now. So they had some ability to go out and debt the taxpayers and future generations to try and stave off the crisis. The government had the ability to do that. The Federal Reserve had the ability to do that. Neither one of them were in great shape, but they at least still had a little bit of ammunition left to fight the crisis. Yeah. Now you've got no capital with the Federal Reserve. You've got no room to move interest rates down to the Federal Reserve. You've got a government that is $20 trillion in debt, that is 107% of GDP, and now the policy is, let's spend tons of money on all this stuff, and none of this makes any sense. You can't spend money, all this money that they have. You're going to rack up huge deficits in a time when the national debt's already $20 trillion. And if you break down the U.S. government spending every single year, these people are spending almost $500 billion a year just to pay interest on the money that they already owe. Almost $500 billion just on interest. They'll spend $1 trillion. I mean, almost all the money they spend goes to, all the tax revenue that they take in, every single penny, is mopped up by Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt, mandatory entitlement programs. There's a little bit of money left over for defense, but they can't even cover half of the defense budget with the money that's left over. Every other thing in government, ranging from the fuel that goes in the president's airplane, the light bill at the White House, the national parks, the Internal Revenue Service. They don't have any money for any of this stuff. They could literally shut down almost everything we know of as government. They could shut down the highway department and the energy department, literally get rid of entire departments of government, and they would still be losing money every single year. This is a systemic problem. This is a structural problem. And so, to say, let's have a Federal Reserve Bank with no capital. Let's have interest rates well below their level that allows us to be able to fight off a recession. Let's have a government $20 trillion in debt, and then let's go and and have some bold, multi-trillion-dollar spending package to fix the highways and all that stuff. Yeah, it sounds great. I'm sure we would all love to see that happen, but I would sure love to see myself be the starting quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys too. Some things just aren't going to happen, and you
Right.
cannot realistically expect that all this stuff is going to happen.
Okay. So now we kind of pinpointed a couple areas that you just mentioned, all the spending, the debt, the interest rates, things like that. Now, so it looks like the only solution will be to print their way out of a problem. But yet, while other countries around the world are withdrawing cash from their citizens, especially the high denomination notes, how will we, either it will be direct credit through lending, in the form of digits and banks and everybody's account, or will it be printing of like paper, or what are some scenarios on how they're going to try to,
Wow.
print
Well,
themselves out of this?
I'll just clarify a little bit further. You
Mhm.
said there's the only way out is to print. I would say the only way out is to default, and I'll explain what I mean by that, because default covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Default is the only way out, but it's a question of how do they default. They'll either default on their obligations to their creditors, the people that basically loaned money to the federal government. That could be the Chinese, could be the banks, which basically means that your deposit and my deposit, and everybody else who has a deposit at the bank, it's the banks that own a lot of these government bonds, right? And so they'll have to default on these, on some portion of the bonds. So maybe they default on the banks. And that, of course, causes this massive financial crisis in the United States, because then people lose out on their savings and the banks go under. So they can't really do that. Some people have suggested, and there are a lot of people in Congress that have openly suggested defaulting on all the debt that's owned by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has a $4.5 trillion balance sheet. And so some people say, hey, the debt level in the United States is too high. Let's default on the Federal Reserve and just tell the Federal Reserve, sorry, we're just not going to pay you all this money that the government owes. And people that suggest that leave absolutely no doubt that they have zero monetary literacy. Because if you default on the Federal Reserve, now the Federal Reserve absolutely is insolvent. And when you have an insolvent central bank, you have a currency crisis. So, so by defaulting on the commercial banks, now you have a financial crisis in the United States because everybody loses their savings. By defaulting on the Federal Reserve, you have a currency crisis. By defaulting on who else owns all this debt? The Chinese. You could default on the Chinese. Say, oh, the Chinese own $2 trillion worth of debt. Let's default on those guys. Well, if you default on the Chinese, now there's no external lender in the world that's willing to lend to you. And by the way, now since the U.S. dollar is basically the quote risk-free currency around the world, now you cause a global financial crisis because you throw the entire financial system in doubt. Because everybody expects the U.S. government is always going to pay its debts. And so if the U.S. government defaults on an external lender, you create a global financial crisis. The other big owner of U.S. Treasuries is the Social Security trust funds. If you default on the Social Security trust funds, now there's no more Social Security. So you create a domestic social crisis. So any one of these options, if they default, they end up creating some kind of crisis, which leads to another kind of default is they default on their obligations to their taxpayers, to their citizens. And one of those obligations is when they say, I promise we will maintain a sound currency. That is an obligation of the government and the central banks, is to maintain a sound currency. And so their way out is they look at all these options and say, we have to default on the Chinese, we default on the central bank, we default on the commercial banks, we default on Social Security. All those are bad ideas because they create immediate crisis. So the palatable idea is they say, let's default on the obligations to the citizens to maintain a sound currency. And so we'll just engineer inflation.
This concludes my conversation with Simon Black from sovereignman.com. Click the subscribe button to be alerted when part 2 is out, in which we talk about the cash crisis happening globally, as well as he shares his thoughts on the Federal Reserve note. See you in part 2.